Good morning, everyone. My name is Matthew Kaminski. I'm the executive editor of Politico, and we're really delighted to welcome you to Politico's Connected Citizens Summit here in Amsterdam. It's a really special occasion for us for multiple reasons. One is that this is our first event in Amsterdam. And when Politico was founded last year, we were born in April of 2015 as a joint venture between Politico in the US and the German publishing house Axel Springer. One of our missions has been really to bring to life European politics and really bring the European story to a wider audience throughout the continent. That we are said to be obsessed, and to a certain degree we are, with the Brussels bubble and all its strange habits. But part of what we're trying to do is really inform a wider public, a wider audience, especially in the key European power centers, Berlin, London, Paris, Amsterdam, on what is happening in Brussels in detail, and hopefully with insights and a bit of fun that you don't normally find in other media. That's really our goal, is to cover politics and policy in a intense way for essentially an audience for whom this is really more than a passing interest. Like I assume for a lot of you, this is part of your professional interest. You may be a bit obsessional, like we are, about politics. So we also see what we do is trying to kind of create communities of people who are interested in these topics and to bring them together through our morning newsletters, through our website, through our newspaper, which you have here. We are still in print. We believe there's a great future in print too. But also to bring them physically together in rooms, that our events are an extension of our journalism and a way to have a two-way conversation with a very well-informed audience, and hopefully to inform a wider audience, which is tuning in hopefully through Facebook Live, and really bring to life a European debate that is so essential, especially as we head into 2 days from now into a referendum in the UK, which could very well remake the future of this continent and this project. I want to first of all thank our sponsors, Facebook, Microsoft, and Qualcomm, who made this event possible and made it possible for us to come up. It's not very far by Thalys from Brussels, but to make it up to Amsterdam and to even get some sun, which is really the miracle so far of this week, as well as our media partner, NRC, here in the Netherlands. We want this to be a very interactive, dynamic session, so there will be plenty of time for questions. Please tweet questions or comments or whatever happens here using the hashtag CC Summit. This event is being filmed and it is being live streamed on Facebook Live. And I wanted to also remind you that there's a different Wi-Fi password and login that does work. It's just on your screen down here. At the end of the day, please fill in your delegates form. We really hope this is our first of multiple events here in Amsterdam as well as in other cities, but we rely on your feedback to tell us what we could have done better, what you did like, what you want to see more of, or what kind of topics we should be raising here. We decided to come to Amsterdam at the tail end of the Dutch presidency of the EU, which makes it timely, and also focus on a topic which is so central to debates around Brussels, around Europe, and really around the world. What sort of digital future are we going to forge? I mean, we all obviously live in a digital world right now. It affects everyone, not just tech companies. And the rise of this digital world, of the 21st digital century, has raised all kinds of questions. You know, how do we encourage innovation and growth? How do we protect our citizens physically? How do we protect their privacy? And a concern for us is always, what is the role of politicians and policymakers? Where's that sort of that intersection and what's going on at the intersection point? And that's really where Politico comes in. We are trying to shine a light on where the world of digital world, technology world meets the political world. I think we're going to have a great discussion throughout the day. We have panels on various themes related to the digital single market, to connected cities, smart cities, and a lot of great speakers. To start us off this morning, we're going to tackle a theme that I mentioned of how are people going to be protected physically, that in this world of disappearing borders, of far easier communication, far easier travel, we have seen quite dramatically in the last 6 months, obviously in Paris in November and in Brussels in March. Even this morning, there was a story out of Brussels, still unconfirmed, of a possible bomb threat against a shopping mall on Rue Neuve downtown. How are our state authorities responding to the growing terrorist threat in Europe, and how are they considering the balance between security and civil liberties? It's been a debate, obviously, going back to 9/11, and it's probably an endless debate in democracies going back to the dawn of democracy. I want to invite on stage our two speakers this morning. They are two Robs, as it happens. Rob Wainwright, who is the director of Europol based in The Hague, and Rob Bertollet, who is the Director General of Dutch General Intelligence and Security Services, which I asked him before if he's kind of like the Dutch head of CIA, and he told me no, not exactly, because in the Netherlands you combine both domestic and external service security in one service. So please welcome them on stage, and so we can begin. Why don't I sit in the middle and I can moderate? Okay. Perfect, thank you. So we are in a digital age, but we're also in a new terrorist age. And that's been foremost of anyone who lives on this continent. I think Paris has brought that home, although we had examples before. Now, Rob Wainwright, you head up Europol, which tries to get European police authorities as well as intelligence services to work together to meet a threat which is by nature transnational in a Europe where anyone with an EU passport can cross borders very, very easily in the Schengen zone. And the question I have for you is maybe, what does Rob Bertollet, what does he need to give you, and what do you need more from him to make your job easier and to make it possible to, because after every attack, we always have a emergency interior ministers summit in Brussels saying, we're going to get our act together, we're going to share information better. What do you need to make that happen?
I think the law enforcement and intelligence community together are sort of learning about the effects of, as you called it, a more transnational terrorist threat, and indeed serious crime, cybercrime especially so, becoming by its very nature transnational, making use of the conditions of globalization like the free movement of people, but especially technology, to advance in a way and operate in a way we've never seen before, and to operate in a way which challenges our security community. To increase our ability to work across borders, increase our ability to work as a concerted community, especially in the sharing of data. And I think the sharing of data is the key very often to identifying and preventing terrorist attacks, is the key to understanding how these much more transnational organized crime and terrorist groups are threatening us, as I said, in ways we've never seen before. So quite rightly, I think, after the terrible tragedies here in Europe in the last few months, I think a lot of the political public debate was around just how optimal current information sharing arrangements were. And I think it's led to maybe a reassertion in the minds of some people of the intrinsic need to increase information sharing, and therefore Rob and his role, and he can speak for that, not just in terms of the work that he does to lead the service here in the Netherlands, but also chairing a concerted European intelligence community, has been very active in helping, I think, to put in place a better set of conditions for the sharing of intelligence within the intelligence community, but also between the intelligence community and the police world. And we're seeing the effects of that in Europol. You know, in the 6 months since the attacks in Paris, the amount and the quality of the data that we now hold on terrorist suspects in Europe, particularly those that have traveled to and from Syria and Iraq, has more than doubled. Allows us, therefore, to concert at a European level a much better understanding of the real threats that we face. And I make one final point, Matthew, as to why this is important. Because also what has changed is the profile of the typical terrorist. Many of them, a majority of them indeed, are responsible for the most recent attacks, have a criminal background, criminal profile. And that's important in terms of how we gear our response, because the data about who they are, where they've come from, who in the criminal community and the gang culture maybe that they grew up, they might still be in contact with, which might be relevant for their terrorist activities now. That kind of data might be found in traditional intelligence data sets, but it could easily be found also in very traditional police data sets, in local drug squads, for example, or other national police data. And that's where Europol can add real value, I think, is in providing what we do, a pan-European, very rich database of criminal activity as well as what we have on terrorism.
But what I know from what I understand about intelligence services, there's nothing that you guard more than your sources. And that's something that all intelligence services guard very jealously. The US and the UK probably share more than any two countries on the world, but it's really something which, and I wonder, how do you square the need to protect your sources with the need that Rob has identified to work more closely together?
Before I get to that, if you allow me, my minister asked me to say hello because he really wanted to be here, simply because of the fact that he supports your mission and he supports your objectives. But he has to be in, he was invited to the Senate, right. And you know, a politician who is invited to the Senate, he cannot reject that invitation. And so it was not a hard decision. I could stand in for him here, but I could not stand in for him in Senate. So that's where he is, but he says hello. Now back to your question. One of the things...
Glad to have you.
Sorry?
We're glad to have you.
Yeah, well, thank you. I like to be here, by the way. Although I'm not sure whether I liked... We said, well, don't call me the director of the CIA, because you put me in a frame directly, and then you sort of reinforce the frame by saying, you know, he's not only the internal, but he's also the external. So you make it sound
You're a super CIA director,
even worse than that. No, I'm just kidding. Back to your question. And what struck me in your question is that you mentioned that we're guarding as an intelligence service our sources, and we are protecting our sources almost jealously. You make it sound like we are protecting that because we see it as a kind of value that we need to trade or whatever. But the real reason for protecting our sources is that if we don't protect our sources anymore, and if we don't protect them vigilantly, then they will not talk to us anymore, and we will lose the sources. And having said that, I think you would be amazed about the amount of information that we share. First of all, in the Netherlands, we have a very good working relationship and a very good cooperation with our national police, because my service is not an executive service, meaning we do not apprehend people, we do not arrest them, we do not shoot them, we do nothing that other organizations might do. So we need to cooperate with our national police, and we do that. And we've come a long way in the past decades. Now, the same goes for cooperation and sharing of information at the international level. There's a lot of information going around between the various European and outside Europe security services, simply because of the fact that we all share the same interests. Like Rob mentioned, today's threats, be it terrorist or be it the threat in cyberspace, they are virtually and literally without borders. You can cross every border in Europe like it does not exist, both in real and in virtual space. So if only for that reason, we really have to share. And I do share a lot of information with Europol. The thing with cooperation is you're never done with cooperating. You're never done with finding ways to better cooperate. And that is what we do. That is what we did at the Counterterrorism Group, the European platform for all the European security services, plus Switzerland and Norway. And what we decided last year was, if we see that our opponents find the best ways to use digital space, find the best ways to travel through Europe, if they have built a absolutely fabulous network, then we have to be the better network. And you can only do that by cooperating. So that's what we do.
Are there, obviously there's some cultural and political habits that you're trying to overcome. Are there also practical barriers to sharing information, to getting intelligence services, police authorities to talk to each other, or whether digitally or physically?
No, there are no practical barriers. We've created, I think, at Europol, for example, a technical means by which we now have over 700 law enforcement agencies connected on our platform. It's an enormous platform that we've established right across Europe and with our international partners to provide the framework, technical, practical framework, in a safe environment, a secure environment, an environment that fully protects data protection rights, to exchange thousands of intelligence messages every day about ongoing investigations, primarily against criminal activities, but increasingly on terrorism as well. So it's not a practical issue. It's one more about the culture and the mindset, I think, of national authorities to share more, and we're seeing that changing before our very eyes, not across the board, but with many countries, including the Netherlands, I say, taking a very proactive, constructive lead. Where there are some practical difficulties, actually, are at the level of a better concerting of information between different systems in the EU. And that's been a really interesting part of the post-Paris debate as well, about the extent to which we have created a set of information systems in the European Union, Schengen Information System, Europol, Eurodac, many, many others, that are not connected with one another, not interconnected. And whereas the first reaction after Paris, including those in Parliament, I have to say, when I gave evidence, was, whose mistake was that? How on earth do you create something that a set of systems that are not talking to each other for security purposes? It wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate choice by our lawmakers to keep them disconnected in the name of upholding, therefore, privacy rights at the expense of security. Now, I'm not decrying that decision. That was made in good faith. But what it means is that now that the frame for that has changed, there has to be some significant technical re-engineering, which is challenging. And exactly the debate that we're having here about security and privacy will be a very important part of that debate, and I've discussed it with Giovanni Butarelli and others about how we can do that in a sensible way. But I do want to get to a position where the two largest security databases in Europe, the Schengen Information System and what Europol has, should be talking to each other in a much more systematic way than they are at the moment, because that is, for the moment, a security challenge that we're facing.
If you were the emperor of Europe, how much more surveillance do you think the continent needs to put in place to make you sleep better at night?
Well, that's a good question, but I don't think that we need much more surveillance, as you put it. I think that we have the right, in almost every part of our life, a regulated life in Europe and in the West, we have found a proportionate way in our law to provide the state authorities with the means by which to protect the public. By balancing, therefore, the need for privacy, a fundamental right, which is not an absolute right, of course. And the courts all the time are setting limits on the way in which people's individual privacy rights. There are limits on that in the name of protecting the public from threats of terrorism, for example. And I think what I mean by that is that we allow police and security service authorities the right to conduct certain surveillance operations in an intrusive way. It is intrusive to intercept a telephone call, to have access to bank accounts, to run physical surveillance operation on targets. All of this is regulated and accepted in society by a large majority of the population. It is not happening on the online space because because it's much more difficult to do that in a regulated and proportional way. The technical reason why it's happening in the online space, not one about a different kind of argument about the needs to uphold privacy. It's the same argument, same principle in the end. So surveillance, targeted surveillance in a proportionate way is absolutely necessary for any Western democracy, I think. And we managed to apply that in the right regulated way, in a way that is accepted in all of parts of our private life, but not so far in the technology space. And we haven't yet been able to find the right solution for that.
Before I field a question from the floor, let me just, on this point, come to you. You will correct my understanding of what's going on in the Netherlands, but you're preparing a new law which would push the envelope to allow you and your colleagues to collect more data, collect more information, essentially do more surveillance. Does that mean that the Netherlands has been behind the curve on this? And how much powers do you actually need? How much capabilities do you need to keep this country safe?
I will come to that. I would like to first mention that what Rob said on the law enforcement side, what kind of practical barriers do you have for sharing information? I think I would agree with him. And the professionals in both the security and the law enforcement side and the intelligence side are trying to find ways to share information. At the same time, what I experience every day is that, you know, if I sort of enlarge it a little bit and on the odd days, politicians say you have to share more information. On the even days, they will tell me, be careful with sharing information. That is something that we really have to regulate. And for me, as a professional, that's not always easy to deal with. Now, that brings me to the question, are we behind the curve now? Well, I don't think we're behind the curve now, but we run the risk of getting behind the curve if we do not make sure that the development of our authorities, of our capabilities, keep the same pace with the development of technology in the world outside, and the way everybody here in the room, but more important for me, terrorists and those who use cyberspace to actively spy or even spy on our community or try to disrupt our lives, we have to make sure that we can keep up with those developments. It's not about more surveillance and trying to find out everything about everybody, because first of all, that is something we're not allowed, and my security service is working in a democratic society with proper safeguards and with proper review and oversight and so on. So I have to abide by the law, and that is something that everybody in my organization understands. It's not about getting to know more and everything about everybody. It's about trying to keep up with the threat in order to make sure that we can live our lives in the way that we together have decided to do that. And what strikes me is that the discussion is always about, well, you know, I have to sacrifice my privacy for security. I would like to turn around that question. If you want to answer the question, how much privacy do you want to give up in order to have your security, then you have to answer the question as well, how much security do you want to sacrifice in order to safeguard your privacy? You know, and I think the discussion on this is incomplete.
Where do you see the law going here? Where would you want to see it going?
Well, what I would like to see in order to properly protect the security of the Netherlands, and you know, to be quite honest, it's not about the Netherlands, it's about Europe, it's about our Western world and our Western values. We really need to keep up with technology development. You know, I always try to paint the picture in this way. In 1993, I think there were about 130 web pages. In 2014, there were 1 billion websites. Every 4 seconds, a new malware is developed. That is the threat that we are facing. That is what I have to keep up. If you look at, well, you know, Rob already told something about the threat on the terrorism side. But it's the two things that I have to deal with. And I really need the instruments. If you don't give me the instruments, then you have to accept that I can't do my part in securing community in the Netherlands as we're used to it. I can live with that if that is a political decision.
I think I saw a question from the audience. We do have a microphone coming up. Maybe go ahead. Right there in the middle. Please introduce yourself and.
Hi there. Hi there. I'm Chris Spillane. I'm one of the reporters at POLITICO. I cover technology. So I have got my laptop here to read the question off, just so I don't mess it up. So sorry if I look a bit weird. I want to talk to you about the question of e-evidence. It seems there's more and more data is being encrypted on devices, laptops, very inaccessible, hard to retrieve. What would you like European lawmakers to do about that? Would you like more access to it?
I think you framed it as the e-evidence, and that's a good point, because very often I think this debate is framed post-Snowden, especially in terms of, how comfortable are we with the spies having access to our private data? It's more and more framed around that. Actually, when you use the word e-evidence, it illustrates the fact that this is also about running a criminal justice system in a modern democratic way. What I mean by that is that whatever else has happened, however else technology has changed our worlds, police are still in the same business of identifying, preventing crime, apprehending those, and bringing people to justice and bringing the necessary evidence by which they can be tried in court. It's just that the evidence base is increasingly found in information that's held in the online domain. And that's important. So getting access to information to put before a court is now increasingly in the hands of private companies online. And if we just want to continue to run a well-functioning criminal justice system, we need access to the same amounts of information, the same levels of evidence that people can be tried in court with. It's just that we have to get access to that now in the online environment. So at the end of the day, this is also a very basic need about criminal justice, not about intelligence agencies spying on us. And so if we don't get this solution right, if we can't find a way to access that information, if we don't have, for example, an effective, harmonized data retention legal regime across Europe, then it's very difficult to get access to that information. And one of the practical effects that Europol faces every single day, for example, in child sexual exploitation inquiries, is that when we finally can break the security of this particular network that is running in thousands of members across Europe and beyond, when we finally can decrypt maybe the information that helps us to identify the offenders and what they've done, we can't get access finally to that information because of data retention or differences in data retention limits in different jurisdictions. And the result of that is that some people are identified and convicted in one country but not in the next. And it's an example of a real practical need, a practical problem that we face in law enforcement. So yes, I think the law does have to change in that material respect and strike a better balance than it has now.
Please don't be shy and raise your hands if for questions in the back, please.
Working? Okay. Yeah, just a question about the Brexit. Would it have any interference with your work in Europol?
Oh, not another Brexit question.
It was inevitable.
I'm looking forward. I'm looking forward to Friday morning. Yes, it will. I mean, I think that if the UK decides to leave the European Union on Thursday, it will have profound implications for the ability of Britain to continue to operate with its European partners in the best way. Now, let's be balanced about that. The cooperation that MI5 enjoys with Rob's service, for example, will continue, largely unaffected. The cooperation that the police agencies have, however, with their partners across Europe will be significantly affected. And I think even in the field of terrorism, counter-terrorist authorities are making more and more use of EU systems. I think the impact is not just for the UK, it's for the rest of the European Union. 40% of all our casework at Europol has a British dimension, either because there's a British police service that has started the case or because there's a British suspect involved. So that's a huge shock, actually, a dislocating shock to Europol, to the EU's ability to continue to run an effective internal security system here in Europe. And of course we can mitigate the effects of that to a certain extent by negotiating some form of continued access to Britain, and I'm sure that that negotiation would be productive. It will end up with something that's not as effective now, and therefore, yes, I think there are security implications which we will have to address very, very carefully, because now is the worst possible time in the face of these urgent terrorist threats and others. It's the worst possible time for any of our members to pull apart. Certainly not some of the most significant members, and one of those that is regarded as a natural leader in security across Europe for the last few decades.
How do you assess the current security threat from terrorism or from Brexit? What is your, give us a sort of a brief security update, maybe. That's what I'm.
Well, as you are well aware, the threat level in the Netherlands is substantial still. I don't think that's going to change, and you know, I consider it substantial as well. And I would agree with Rob that for my cooperation with the British services, probably Brexit wouldn't make a great difference. I mean, a lot of things would be easier if Great Britain would still be in the European Union, and I'm talking about the cooperation. But it will not be affected in such a way that it will all of a sudden raise the threat level in Europe or in the Netherlands. So I'm pretty relaxed on that one.
What is the terrorist threat based that threat assessment here in the Netherlands based on? And do you see the same change we've seen in Belgium, that we're going more from a jihad from Afghanistan to more of a criminal kind of jihad, where these are recent converts to the cause who are more rooted in, you know, had been running drugs or petty criminals?
Well, you know, I think that the threat level in Europe is pretty much comparable. It's pretty much the same. I mean, as I explained earlier, we don't have any borders. You can travel in Europe, and I think that's very good. We should keep it that way. But it also means that it's very easy for terrorists to travel from Brussels to Paris or from Paris to Amsterdam. You know, when we had the attempted attack in the Thalys, he tried to get into the train in Brussels, but it could have easily been Amsterdam. So I think the threat level is the same, and it's a serious threat, and that is something that I worry about every day. As far as the change from the Afghanistan kind of people to Syria and Iraq, we've seen that shift a couple of years ago already. And what we do see, indeed, and I think that is what Rob meant also, is that there are links between terrorist organizations and criminal organizations, because you have to get your weapons somewhere, and you have to get your explosives somewhere. And I think so. We really have to work on that, and it's one of the reasons that we have to work very close together. Police organizations, law enforcement on the one side, and the intelligence organizations on the other side, again, because we have the same interests.
Did anything you learned from Edward Snowden surprise you?
Well, first of all, it presupposes that I learned something from Edward Snowden. But you know, what I think, and I've said that before, what I think is good is the discussion on how to deal with intelligence, on how to deal with security, and on how to deal with privacy. So I like the discussion, because then you can work it out, and you can also decide in an informed way on what you want as a society. What it caused was that many of my targets, so to speak, would-be terrorists or terrorists, they learned from Snowden. They learned how to disguise their operations. They took a more security-minded stance, so they made it harder for me to get into their decision and planning cycle. Because that's what I want. What I want, what my organization wants, what all the other security and intel organizations want when we're talking about terrorism is to get into their decision and planning cycle in order to prevent them from attacking Europe or the Netherlands or Great Britain, or for that matter.
I assume that the U.S. is not the only country that does what Edward Snowden said that it was doing.
Sorry, I'm not sure I get
that the U.S. is not the only country that gathers data and tries to mine it for information.
No, we all gather data. I mean, I can be pretty clear about that. It's in the law. I mean, the law orders me to gather information. But the good thing about it is that it does not just order me to gather information with a very well described purpose, but it also sets the safeguards, it sets the oversight, it sets the control. I can from the bottom of my heart, I can state that I'm the best controlled organization, government organization in the Netherlands, as far as oversight and checks and balances is concerned.
Last question here in the front, please.
Thank you. Rob, I was intrigued by your comment about the privacy not being an absolute. And clearly, part of the solution is legislative. So the fact that data collection and movement is global, where do you see the solution for that problem being, in terms of the fact that many private companies don't see it in the same way? Obviously, they see privacy as an absolute. So how are we going to kind of get over that barrier of being able to solve that problem from a policing and public security point of view?
Yeah, well, I don't think actually many people do see it as an absolute right, actually. Some people do, but I think the mainstream debate is not in that space. It's just about how we can manage a proportional regime where we can have access that doesn't have significant collateral damage. That's the problem. We had a very interesting conference at Europol last month with ENISA, with EDPS and others that were there, in which we identified, actually, mainstream opinion. We had a cross-section of the opinion in this space, from law enforcement through to privacy campaigners, all agreeing in the end that we have to find a better balance than we have now. What is forcing on the police and security services is for us to innovate more, for us to use other measures, other law enforcement intelligence measures that can get access to the intelligence that we need in a different way. So in a way, that's good. It forces us to innovate. I think the next part of that, though, is having access to intrusive investigative measures online. And at the moment, the law is not clear on where that starts and finishes. And I would like to see some regulated space around that in Europe. And finally, in those areas where finally the only possible answer is some kind of decryption of a device or decryption of somebody's communications, because everything else we've tried has failed, and it is critical to stop a terrorist attack, for example, then I do believe that we should invest more in law enforcement's ability, security services' ability to improve their decryption capabilities. And here, I think, the tech industry and law enforcement should be working together in a much more constructive way than we see being played out in public sometimes. And I refuse to, and although these criminals are smart, and we're in this race war, between encryption and decryption. In the end, I refuse to believe that if you bring together the smartest minds in Silicon Valley, the smartest minds in the security industry, I refuse to believe that we will be outsmarted by the criminals. And I do believe that we can find a way in which the decryption capabilities that we need can be applied in very specific targeted circumstances in those cases where it's absolutely needed. And we haven't yet seen that kind of cooperation between industry and the police world that I'd like to see.
So if you were the CEO of Apple, you would have decrypted that phone for the FBI?
I'm not the CEO of Apple.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much to both Rob Wainwright and Rob Bertollet, who really, thank you so much for standing in for Minister Plasterk. And we were we're really happy to have you both. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I have to leave. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks.